recording.
Scattered. Or maybe even fractured. Seems like a pretty fitting word for the state of our world right now, the experiences we've had even in this past week. And this is also the point we're at in the big story. Now, we're looking for a lot of reasons to understand why in society, among nations, we're this scattered, we're this fractured. And there are many reasons near at hand that I know we've all been discussing. But what the big story says to us is maybe you haven't been looking back far enough. What if one of these really ancient stories actually holds some meaning and some insight into the story you're in right now? And today's story from Genesis 11, 1-9, it's that familiar story of the Tower of Babel, is one of these stories that at first glance may seem highly unrelated to today's events. But as we dive into it, we're going to find out it's very related. Let's listen to it together. Genesis 11, verses 1-9. Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. And they said to each other, "Come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly." They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth." But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that men were building. The Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language so they will not understand each other." So the Lord scattered them from there over all the earth, and they stopped building that city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there, the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Lord, I pray that the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts would be acceptable in our sight, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Scattered or fractured. As we start to look at this story, let me remind us where we are in the big story. So if you look at this, remember when we're looking at the arc of the narrative, the arc of the story in the big story, it goes from creation in Genesis to new creation in Revelation. And we're in this portion of the big story of these narratives from Genesis 1 to 11. These are what I call the epic narratives or the universal narratives. These are the stories that are about the whole world before Abraham and the nation of Israel is called. Let's move in just a little closer so you can see why these are so important. And you recognize some of these big stories, right? There's creation, there's the expulsion from the garden in Genesis 3 after the temptation and the trespass that we talked about last week. There's the flood in Genesis 6-9. And then there's today's story, the Tower of Babel in Genesis 11. And the reason I have those squiggly red lines on there is because each one of these epic or universal stories narrates a moment of collapse, a moment of chaos, a moment where humanity pulled away from God and either had judgment or scattering or expulsion as a result. And so the story of humanity isn't great shakes in these first 11 chapters. It's just one failure after another. They're expelled in response to the disobedience in the garden. The earth is destroyed in the flood in response to the absolute evil. And if you've read in your readings from this past week the stories of the flood, you read how God was grieved he'd made humanity. That's a deeply emotional word in the Hebrew. Every single heart of every single human was so given over to evil, except for one person, Noah, who was still righteous. And then all the nations that are listed in the table of nations in Genesis 10 are descendants of Noah. And we get to Genesis 11 and the Tower of Babel and the scattering, the fracturing in the face of idolatry, which we're going to go deeper into. But let me put this back in the context of the big story again, because here's what's really important is to see that these opening universal narratives, they will be repeated over and over and over again in the big story. And what God's going to do his mission, which is healing the world, restoring creation, what God is going to use to heal and restore everything that humanity initially created in the image of God is destroying is one promise after another. Because think about the promises of the new creation that we've read about in the New Testament. Promises of forgiveness for disobedience. Promises of righteousness for evil. Promises of gathering and regathering for the scattered nations. These are all promises that are going to be essential. So you can see how these stories are story patterns that keep fitting into the big story. They're repeated over and over and over. We see them all started in this new one and go to the very end, so that even our meditation verse for today shows that these stories are fully in view when we get to the end of the big story. On either side of the river is the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, producing its fruit in each month, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. You hear the difference between the tree that expelled Adam and Eve, humanity, from the garden, and the leaves of the tree for the healing of the nations scattered and fractured at the Tower of Babel. So let's focus back in again on these epic or universal narratives so I can show you one other thing that's really important for where we're going. You'll notice that after every one of those red squiggly lines, after every collapse, God makes a promise. A promise. We talked about the promise in the garden, about the descendant of Eve that comes after the collapse, the disobedience. You know about the rainbow in the sky, the promise to Noah after the flood. But then we get to the Tower of Babel, and this ends without a promise. But promise, like I just told you, is what moves the story forward. So what's going on here in the big story? Well, actually, it's a perfect transition to the next part of the big story that we're going into in October, that I want to give us a little sneak peek preview here of. What you're looking at is the cover of the sermon companion guides that are online to go with the sermons for this week. Our theme for October, as we move into the specific stories about Abraham and his family after the Tower of Babel, is faith journeys. We're going to go on a faith journey with Abraham. We're going to go on a faith journey with Moses and the children of Israel rescued from the oppression of Egypt. We're going to go on a faith journey with that first generation in the wilderness, and a journey with Ruth and Boaz and their loyalty. And the important thing about this, why I'm showing this to you right now on the screen, is so that you can be involved with it in the sermon resources that we have. There are daily readings and group readings, family readings, friendship notes for how we take this journey together. The key is we're going to be on God's mission together of living into the promise of being a blessing to the nations that came as a result of the scattering and the fracturing of the Tower of Babel. So let's go back to that scattering and fracturing for a moment, and I want to show you two resources that I want to recommend to you that I'm using pretty extensively as we talk through this final one of our epic narratives, our universal narratives. One of these books is a book by Andy Crouch called The Strong and the Weak. And you've heard me talk about authority and vulnerability. You've heard me talk about dignity and dependence. Well, this idea of authority and vulnerability together being essential to being made in the image of God is one that I learned from Andy Crouch in his book, The Strong and the Weak. And then today's story looks at idolatry. So I want to recommend to you this book by Timothy Keller called Counterfeit Gods, The Empty Promises of Money, Sex, and Power, and the Only Hope That Matters. So let's dig into these stories using some of the wisdom and some of the ways, especially that Andy Crouch talks about authority and vulnerability. And I want to show you a sort of a 4-quadrant drawing here. Now, one of the lines, the horizontal line on my axis here, is dependence or vulnerability. We've talked about that over and over again, that to be made in the image of God is to be dependent, is to be vulnerable. And then the other axis, the one that's going up and down, the vertical, is the one that deals with authority, with dominion, with dignity. Now, these two things together, when they're lived out together, are what make up the image of God. That's in the upper right quadrant. Living with authority and vulnerability, dignity and dependence on God together is how we're meant to be living as human beings in the image of God. But do you remember what happened in the garden last week? If you move over to the upper left there. What happened in the garden last week is the lie that the serpent told to Eve was, you know what? You can be like God without vulnerability. You won't die. You can have total dignity, total authority, total dominion without any of this dependence, any of this vulnerability. The invitation and the lie was an invitation to that upper left quadrant. And once they reached out in that temptation or that invitation, once Adam and Eve ate of the fruit, where they actually found themselves was in that lower right quadrant, where they actually found themselves and where we find ourselves naturally as human beings, is being exposed and being enslaved to sin. Having this exposure, this vulnerability, this dependence in the world, without the dignity and the authority to overcome it. And do you remember what Adam and Eve did? Look at that lower left corner. That's where there's neither vulnerability nor authority. They just hid. They hid from God. So as we look at these stories in the epic narratives, I want to look at them through this matrix because I think it's kind of an interesting one, particularly when we get to the Tower of Babel. Because what we see in the Noah story, one way of understanding what it means that Noah was righteous is righteous you can think of as a synonym for image of God. When you read in your Bible and you run into the word righteous, think image of God. The righteous person lives out the vocation God has given them with the dominion and the dignity and the full dependence on God. Whereas those who don't, whose hearts were full with evil, who exploit and practice violence, they live out in full control. There's no dependence. And that led to judgment and to the flood. And so what's happening in today's story? Well, today's story, the nations that descended from Noah had the exact same vocation as all humanity, the exact same call to partnership as Noah and his family on the other side of that flood. And it was the call and the vocation to live out their partnership as those created in the image of God. The call and vocation to live out the resources and power that God had given them for God's glory and God's purpose, to be fruitful and to multiply. But what happened as we look at the story? Let's build a tower. We see them applying this new technology of making the bricks and using the tar for mortar. They're applying their technology to build a tower. And did you catch that phrase? To make a name for ourselves. Now, the human vocation is to glorify God. The human vocation is to make a name for God. The human vocation is that God is glorified for the beauty and the creativity and the fruitfulness of God's creation, for the flourishing of humanity and all of creation. But what we see in the Tower of Babel is a desire now to be rid of God and then to go one step further, to not only be rid of God, but now make a name for ourselves. So the image bearers become idol makers. The image bearers, rejecting dependence, rejecting vulnerability, become idol makers. And here's the second thing I want us to notice about this, is whereas Adam and Eve talk about individual sin, it's representative of all people, but it's very much individual relationships. The Tower of Babel, this is social. This is cultures. This is nations. This is entire families working together for this idolatry. So there's one type of sin we see in the Bible, which is sin as disobedience. It's sin as breaking the rules, as crossing the lines that God has put down for us. But another incredibly important heart of a sinful area we see in Scripture is what the Bible talks about as idolatry. And idolatry is what you get when humanity wants control, authority, dominance, dignity, without any dependency. It's self-glory, it's human glory, it's human control without God. So first we reject dependence on God, and then we put ourselves in the place of God. Instead of worshiping and serving God, giving our best selves and our best technology to glorify God, it's worshiping and serving their own name in the story of the Tower of Babel. And this story is going to continue to be repeated over and over and over again in the Bible. You heard it in the passage from Isaiah that Steve read when he was going into his prayer of confession. In Isaiah chapter 2, the beginning of which has these, like the very favorite passages we have about beating our weapons into plowshares, our swords into plowshares. It's this wonderful image of peace that called us into worship. The reality hits then in Isaiah 2, 8 through 9, where the prophet says, "Their land is filled with idols. They bow down to the work of their hands, to what their own fingers have made. And so people are humbled and everyone is brought low." Do you hear the scattering? Do you hear the fracturing? If there's going to be a rescue mission from the violence and the fracturing among and within the whole of society, then the idolatry, shared idolatry among and within human society will have to be confronted and rescued. Because, see, Babel is a sort of foreshadowing of Babylon. Babel is a foreshadowing of every human empire that is so dedicated to their own authority and their own control and their own glory that others are exposed and enslaved by them. I mean, maybe you're someone that's like, so what's the deal with this God? Why does this God care? Why can't humanity, that's been made pretty cool, use their technology, which is pretty wonderful, to just go ahead and build a tower? Why is this God so threatened by that? Well, let me show you. Let's go back to our quadrant, right? Because when there are people who are determined in idolatry to exalt themselves, to do authority and control without any vulnerability and any dependence, they will inevitably expose and enslave people who don't have their control and don't have their authority. Let me read you something Andy Crouch has written. In the grip of idols, we believe that our problem is not enough authority. Life becomes a quest to acquire enough authority to manage and minimize our vulnerability. Close quote. See, this is what happens is you and I, we feel ourselves being in that lower right quadrant. We recognize our own vulnerability. We recognize our own dependence. One of the examples that Andy Crouch gives is when we walk into a room full of strangers, which is a vulnerable situation for anyone except the most extreme extroverts, right? We're kind of conditioned by society to go ahead and grab ourselves a drink. Because this drink gives us the promise of sheltering us a bit in human society. It's an idolatrous invitation when it's the source of our shelter or control. And Crouch talks about how easily that using of a wonderful thing, wine that is from the fruit of the vine that God has made, that's meant for joy, that's meant for celebration, something that should be a good thing, enjoyed with the glory of God, becomes something we depend upon for our safety, for our protection, for our control in a vulnerable situation. And you know how this happens with idols. Idols continue to promise us safety and control while they're hooking us and enslaving us the whole time. This is a whole different conversation, how this happens personally. We've talked about this before. Many people have talked about this before. What the story of Tower of Babel is so interested in is how this happens socially, how this happens with nations, with families, with peoples, and why it's so dangerous. Because what happens is human societies build our towers of Babel. We take our technology, or our military power, or economic might, or sexual power and exploitation, and make a name for ourselves. And as we read the big story, we're going to see this happen with both Israel and all of the other empires around them. Egypt will use its authority, its control, its might to exploit and enslave Israel. Israel will use its eventual power, authority, and might to exploit and enslave foreigners and the poor, to oppress the poor. The wealth and the security and sex practices that play out in the worship of fertility cults will end up in the exploitation of children and even the murder of children. Injustice results when the idolatry of societies and nations, by their chasing after, by their building up their technological or their military power or their economic might, their sexual exploitation, their sexual worship, this leads to the exploitation, the enslaving of those who are exposed, those who are vulnerable. And the really challenging thing when we read this big story, and I want us to be ready for this as a church family, the challenging thing is we'll not only read about this with all of the different empires in the New Testament, but there's a good chance we're going to find ourselves in this big story. See, if we listen closely enough, we may hear ourselves in the enslavement of Africans for the sake of economic might. Or we may hear our own story in the exploitation of native populations so that our own peoples can expand. We may hear our own story in dependence on military power and alliances, or find that our reliance on technology and the danger of exploitation through that reliance. We may find that we hear our own story in the exploitation of migrant labor or underpaid workers for an economy to thrive. Or we may find that we hear our own story in our sexual obsession, our sexual worship that exploits the vulnerable, and especially that it destroys unborn children. We may even find one of the most insidious temptations of all that we find in this big story. This false gospel that says the way to fix exploitation or enslavement or the exposure of people is for self-importance, self-promotion, self-determination. I mean, I think if you listened closely enough, at least one thing I said pushed a button. Because we live in the middle of the story of human social sin and fallenness. And it's a risky place. It's impossible for me not to have made someone, including myself, anxious or annoyed because of that list, because we're all in a part of human society, and the Tower of Babel is a story of all of human society. It's meant to shake us up a bit, because if we're not shaken up, do you know where we actually naturally go to live? It's in that lower left corner. Remember the hiding corner? Remember the safe corner? This is the place where we just go, listen, I don't want any authority. I don't want any part of this. And I don't want any vulnerability to it. I just want to live my life. I just want to be safe here. Andy Crouch calls this the going on a cruise corner, right? You're not steering the ship. You have no control over it. You're just comfortable. You're just safe. This is the safety of video games. This is the safety of being able to post things on our social feeds. This can be the danger of a virtual church, and one we have to watch out for during this season when we're online. Because the truth is, no one is only in one of these squares. And this is why we've got to hear this big story. Not a single one of us live in only one of these squares. We all know the experience of feeling scared and exposed. We all know how hard we try to stay in control and to have authority. We all want to be comfortable. But none of us by ourselves can move back up into that upper right quadrant where authority and vulnerability, where dignity and dependence are put back together into the image of God. I mean, just think about how hard the conversation about police brutality is right now. There are many of us in the lower left corner who are very comfortable, and we want to be kept that way. We're scared of being moved over into the lower right corner. We don't want violence or society getting out of control to move us over there. And so many of us can want the police to be more and more authoritarian, more and more militarized. And let's be honest, I know many police officers, and they feel exposed. They feel vulnerable. And we all know people of color who have told us their stories of their own exposure and vulnerability and danger of the violence that can come from that increased authority. Do you see where we all live in this? This is why we need the big story. Because the best that our societies can do without the big story is just keep moving people between those three corners of authority or vulnerability or hiding from it. The good news in the big story is there can be an invitation back into the image of God. The good news in the big story is that yes, all of us people who are more naturally socially conservative and feel that it really does come down to individual choice, like with Adam and Eve, are right. And yes, all of us who are more naturally socially liberal and do believe it comes to choices like the Tower of Babel and social sins are also right. And both of these aspects of human rebellion and failure are healed and restored in God's mission to bring everyone back into the place of relationship with God through the image of God. What we're going to find in this big story is that the way back into living out righteousness, the way back into living out the dignity of being created in the image of God, the way back into living out the combination of authority and vulnerability of being created in the image of God and partnering with God in this big story is through dependence. The Bible calls it faith. Faith from the dependence on God and God's promises is what restores individuals and society. God's rescue mission, of course, ultimately takes us to Jesus. Jesus, who is the second Adam. Jesus, who is the image of the invisible God. Jesus is the one to whom every single promise for individuals and through nations, for peoples and families, every single promise goes through him. So this week in the travel guide, here's what I want to encourage you to do. You'll find these questions in the travel guide online. The first question you're going to find is the question that God asks you when God comes looking for God's people on his rescue mission. Where are you? Where are you? And I wonder if you'll have the courage to sit before God, to listen for the places and the ways that you live in the idolatry space, the comfort space, or are feeling very exposed. And then the second question is, where are we? As a society, where are we? One exploration of that question you can do on Wednesday night in our big conversations continuation. David Brenner, my husband, is going to be leading the conversation on technology and faith, artificial intelligence and faith. It's just one aspect of the invitations and the dangers of what we do as a society with all that God has entrusted to us. but then also in our journey groups, in our connect groups, in our small groups. We want to talk through and find ways to use this story to talk through where we are as a culture. Because if we can talk it through in the pages of the big story, I truly believe that God's rescue mission in Jesus Christ is to heal all that is hurting so much in our relationships, our society, our family, our nations, with the fracturing, the scattering, the divisions. Amen. So Adam, shall I do the, William? Shall we get this out of the way and I will do the welcome and the benediction real quickly?
Sure. Want me to stop this recording then?
Yeah, you can stop this.